teaches Elijah to hear in the silence. Now, some are familiar with this story. You remember that God is not in the wind or the earthquake or the fire, but God is in the still small voice. The Hebrew expression for still small voice means something like the sound of a thin whisper or a soft calm or quiet. Other translations of the Bible of these words, we have the words gentle whisper, or a soft whisper, or a soft murmuring sound, or even a sound of gentle blowing. So here now, these words we find in 1 Kings. It's chapter 19, it's verses 1 through the first part of verse 15. Listen for God's word. Ahab told Jezebel that what Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. Then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So may the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life like the life of one of them by this time tomorrow." Then Elijah, was afraid. And he got up and he fled for his life, and he came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah. He left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a solitary broom tree. He asked that he might die. "It is enough now, O Lord. Take away my life, for I am no longer better than any of my ancestors." And then he lay down under the broom tree and he fell asleep. Suddenly, an angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." And he looked, and there at his head was a cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. He ate and he drank and lay down again. The angel of the Lord came a second time, touched him and said, "Get up and eat, otherwise the journey will be too much for you." He got up and he ate and he drank. Then he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mount of God. And at that place he came to a cave, and he spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." And he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in an earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in a mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." And then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus." And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And I invite you to pray. Gracious God, may we hear in this word how you are speaking to us and calling to us, and we ask that you help us to listen in the silence. And may the words of my mouth and meditations of all our hearts be pleasing and acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Have you ever felt that nobody is on your side? Like everyone and everybody is against you? Feeling this way can be tough. Discouragement and negativity can eat away at us, and it's not a good place to be. In fact, it can produce anguish and anxiety and health issues, and for some, it can be even life-threatening. If you add to these feelings that God cannot be readily found, that God is not present, then it can be even more tough. Elijah in this passage is discouraged. Everything he had turned around on him. He had done some pretty amazing things. He had confronted kings. He confronted the followers of those who worship Baal. He had performed miracles, including raising the dead and even calling lightning to come down from heaven. But at the beginning of chapter 19 of 1 Kings, we find that Elijah is on the run, filled with self-doubt and complaining that things are not going his way. Queen Jezebel is out to get him, and Elijah is running for his life. And Elijah needs to talk with God, to speak with God about all of this. And so he heads to the most religious place that he can think of, a place where Moses had talked with God, Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. It's possible that these two can be the same place. And it's a difficult journey. But God feeds him. God directs him. And when Elijah gets to this sacred place, he complains to God, not unlike others that have complained to God that we read in the Bible. Remember Moses complaining? In Numbers, we read Moses say to God, "I am not able to carry all this people alone, for they are too heavy for me. If this is the way you are going to treat me, put me to death at once, and do not let me see my misery." Elijah in this passage is not unlike another prophet, Jeremiah, who laments about where God is present. Elijah feels that he has been left alone. He believes that no other prophets are left, so he comes to God. He comes to where God had talked with others. Elijah feels that God should have been taking care of him, that God should have been seeing to his welfare, but God, he feels, has left him alone. Mother Teresa once said, "The most terrible poverty is loneliness and the feeling of being unloved." When a tragedy hits, when there is a crisis, we can feel the same. And I'm sure that those in Orlando or other places last week felt the same way. And many in our nation, in our world, are asking right this very minute, where are you, God? Where was your protection? In the passage, God directs Elijah. In a sense, he says, get out of the cave. Stand on the mountain I'm going to pass by. And so Elijah gets out of the cave, out of his self-centeredness, out of his loneliness, and he witnesses the mighty power of nature. An earth-splitting wind, an earthquake, and fire. But as we read, that God was not in these natural events. Now, this is not to mean that God is not actually present in these acts of nature. Rather, God chooses not to reveal God's divine self to Elijah in these ways. Instead, God speaks in the calm after the storm. And God is not speaking in the noise and the turbulence of an earthquake or wind or fire, but in a still small voice, or as the version I read, the sound of sheer silence. What can we make of this? If God wasn't in the thunder and in the noise, then does God only speak in silence? And this question may have come to Elijah's mind. He might have known and did know about how God had interacted with others of his ancestors in the past. He had heard that through visions and dreams, God can be seen and heard, that God can lead the people in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Elijah knew how God had spoken to people in the past, but now this something new. This was something different. A still small voice. Silence. God's voice can be heard even in the silence. Now, some interpret this that God shows up not in the extraordinary, but in the ordinary. I read a sermon this week by one of my favorite preachers, Craig Barnes. He's now the president of Princeton Theological Seminary, and in his sermon, he mentioned how silence can be so overwhelming, that silence can speak. He mentioned that we live in noisy lives, and maybe that we surround ourselves with noise of clutter, that it protects us from the silence because we can find that maybe silence is so overwhelming. And Barnes told a story about he and his wife who traveled about a day's journey north of Santa Fe, New Mexico, to the home of the great painter Georgia O'Keeffe. It was a place that she had built when she left the noise and busyness of New York City in search of a quiet sanctuary in the desert. Her home had been preserved exactly as she had left it. And what Barnes was so struck with is that the walls of her house were stark. There wasn't a single painting hanging on them, not even one of her own paintings. The furniture was mostly covered in white sheets, as it was when she lived there. The whole house was visually silent. And Barnes pondered over this, and it occurred to him that Miss O'Keeffe was listening for creativity that was found only in the sounds of sheer silence. Elijah's life had been filled with dramatic events. But in this passage, we find that God does not come to Elijah in the way that he thought. God was found in silence, in the still small voice. God was heard even in the silence. Even in the silence. Silently, God is and has been present in our world, fighting against all the Jezebels that threaten us. But sometimes the world and others have made us question God, wondered if God really cares. And when we have been pushed to believe that perhaps God is not really present, we can think of silence. God's quiet faithfulness, Craig Barnes said. We may not hear in the silence. We may not understand in the silence about why certain things have happened. But Elijah didn't either. After the silence, God asked him again, "What are you doing here?" And Elijah repeated again what he had said before. "They're after me, and I'm alone, and they're going to kill me." God says, "Keep going." And we didn't read it in this passage that I read a few minutes ago, what really happens next, but in the very next verses, God gives Elijah some reassurance. God says that there are others, that he is not alone. In fact, there are 7,000 others just like him. And God says to him, "Go anoint Elisha. He's the one that's going to take over for you. And by the way, also anoint Hazael and Jehu. They're going to be the new kings of Israel and Judah." You see, God had been working in and through the silence. And we might not be able to see it or hear it now, or even tomorrow, or the next day, or even next year, or the year after. Because sometimes God works not in the extraordinary or in the dramatic events, but often through the silence, through the still small voice. Even in the silence, God's Son came to us, born to us in that little town of Bethlehem, Even in the silence, 33 years later, God's Son crucified on a cross as a common criminal. And through the centuries, through the silence, God has spoken and keeps speaking, reminding us of love and grace and forgiveness. Even in the silence, as refugees escape in boats because of the violence that's present in their homeland. Even in the silence, as families bury their loved ones. Even in the silence, as tragedy and murder strike us at the core of our souls. Even in the silence, God is turning someone around and upside down. Even in the silence. Silently, God is and continues to be present in our world, even in the silence.